Elira had worn the veil for so long that most people in town had forgotten what her face looked like underneath it. It was a thin piece of gray fabric, light enough to breathe through, but thick enough to hide what she never wanted anyone to see. 3 years had passed since the fire that swept through her village, taking her home, her parents, and leaving deep scars across her cheek, her neck, and part of her shoulder. She had survived, but for a long time, survival had felt like punishment instead of a gift. In the beginning, after the fire, people had stared at her with a mixture of pity and discomfort. Some looked away too quickly, as though her face might be contagious. Others stared too long, trying to piece together what had happened, as if her pain were a story they were entitled to hear. Elira could not bear either reaction. So she made the veil part of her daily life, the same way she wore shoes or tied her hair back before working. It became so normal that she almost forgot she had a choice. She lived in a small house at the edge of town, where the noise of the market could still be heard, but where she could slip away quickly if she needed to be alone. She worked mending clothes for the townsfolk, sewing quietly in the back room of a shop owned by an old woman named Bettina, who had never once asked her to remove the veil or explain her past. Bettina simply let her work in peace, and for that, Elira was endlessly grateful. The town had always been calm, tucked between hills and a slow-moving river, far from the wars that shook the northern kingdoms. But that peace ended the day soldiers from the Alpha King's army arrived, seeking shelter and supplies after months of fighting near the border. The war between the northern packs had pushed thousands of people from their homes, and the king himself had come south to oversee the resettlement of refugees who had nowhere else to go. The town had never seen anything like it. Wagons rolled in loaded with wounded soldiers and frightened families. Tents were raised in the fields outside town, and the market square buzzed with unfamiliar voices and unfamiliar fears. Elira watched from a distance, careful to keep to the edges of the crowd, her veil pulled snug against her face. It was on the third day that she first saw him. King Draven did not arrive the way she expected a king to arrive. There were no trumpets, no grand procession. He walked through the town with a handful of guards, dressed simply, his eyes tired in a way that spoke of years spent carrying burdens too heavy for one person. He spoke directly to the townsfolk, asking about food stores, medical supplies, and where new arrivals could be housed. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his voice was calm, steady, without the arrogance she expected from someone with his title. She had not meant to be noticed. She had been carrying a basket of mended clothes back to Bettina's shop when their paths crossed near the well. He paused, just for a moment, his gaze settling on her, not on the veil, not with curiosity or pity, but simply acknowledging her presence, the way he might acknowledge anyone else in the street. He gave a small nod, said good morning, and continued on his way. It was such a small moment, but it stayed with her for days. Over the following weeks, King Draven remained in town, working closely with the local leaders to settle the refugees and rebuild parts of the outskirts damaged by the fighting. Elira found herself crossing paths with him more often than she expected. He came by the shop once to ask Bettina about clothing for children who had arrived with nothing. Elira had been in the back room, but she heard his voice through the thin wall, patient and kind, asking questions instead of giving orders. One afternoon, he came to the fields where grain was being distributed to new arrivals. Elira had volunteered to help organize the lines, mostly because Bettina had asked her to, and she found it hard to say no to the old woman who had given her steady work for 3 years. She stood near a table, checking names against a list, when Draven approached to ask how the distribution was going. "It's slow," she admitted, keeping her eyes on the paper in front of her. "There isn't enough for everyone, not yet." "What would help?" he asked, and there was something in the way he asked it, not testing her, not doubting her, that made her look up, just slightly, meeting his eyes for the first time. "More hands, and someone who can settle arguments without anyone losing face," she said. "People are frightened. Fear makes people forget kindness." He considered her words carefully, nodding slowly. "You understand people well." She almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. "I've had time to watch." He did not ask what she meant. He simply thanked her for her honesty and moved on to speak with the next group of workers. But the next day, 2 more soldiers were assigned to help with distribution, and a system was put in place to settle disputes fairly. Alira noticed. She wondered if he had made the changes because of what she said, or if it was simply good leadership. Either way, it was the first time in years that someone had asked her opinion and actually acted on it. Their conversations became more frequent after that, though never planned. He would come by the fields, or the market, and somehow their paths would cross. He asked about the grain stores, about the mood of the townsfolk, about how the children were adjusting to their new tents and unfamiliar surroundings. She found herself answering more freely than she expected, forgetting sometimes to keep her voice guarded and short. He never once asked about her veil. This was, perhaps, what surprised her most. Everyone who met her eventually asked, in one way or another, some directly, some through careful hints, some through long, uncomfortable silences that begged the question without saying it aloud. But Draven never did. He spoke to her as though the veil was simply part of who she was, no different than the color of her hair or the calluses on her hands from years of sewing. One evening, as the sun began to set behind the hills, she found him sitting alone near the edge of the fields, away from the noise of the camp. He looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, the kind of tired that came from carrying too many decisions, too many lives, on shoulders that were still, underneath the title, simply human. "You look like you could use quiet," she said, surprising herself by speaking first. He looked up, and for a moment, something in his tired eyes softened. "I could," he admitted. "It's rare these days." She sat down a respectful distance away, watching the last light fade over the hills. They did not speak for a while, and the silence between them felt different than the silence she usually carried, lighter, somehow, instead of heavy with things unsaid. "Do you ever miss being just a person?" she asked eventually. "Before all this?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't remember what that felt like anymore," he said. "But sometimes, in moments like this, I think I remember pieces of it." She understood that feeling more than she expected to. There had been a time before the fire when she had been just a person too, unremarkable, ordinary, unafraid of her own reflection. She rarely let herself think about that time anymore. It hurt too much to remember what had been taken. "I used to like the way morning light looked on the river," she said quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "Before." He did not ask before what. He simply nodded, as though understanding that some sentences were meant to stay unfinished. Weeks passed this way, quiet evenings and small conversations building slowly into something Alira did not have a name for. She had long since accepted that connection was not something meant for her, not with the veil, not with the scars beneath it. But here was a man who made her forget, for stretches of time, that she was supposed to be hiding. It was on a cool evening, nearly 2 months after his arrival, that everything changed. The resettlement work was nearly finished. New homes had been built at the edge of town for the refugee families, and the tents that once crowded the fields had slowly emptied as people moved into more permanent shelter. Draven's soldiers had begun preparing to return north, and Alira understood, without needing to be told, that his time in town was coming to an end. She found him near the river that evening, the same river she had once told him she missed watching in the morning light. He stood alone, looking out over the water, and when he heard her approach, he turned, and something in his expression told her he had been waiting. "I leave in 3 days," he said quietly. She nodded, feeling something tighten in her chest that she did not want to name. "I know." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the weight of unspoken words behind his eyes. "Alira," he said, using her name gently, the way one might hold something fragile. "I have never asked you about your veil, not because I did not notice it, but because I did not want you to think that was the only thing I saw." Her breath caught. No one had ever said something like that to her before. "I see the way you speak up for people who cannot speak for themselves," he continued. "I see the patience you show even when you're exhausted. I see the way you notice small kindnesses that other people miss. I see you, Alira. All of you. The veil has never changed that." Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, though she fought to keep them back. "You don't know what's underneath it," she whispered. "You don't know what you'd see." "I know it doesn't matter," he said simply. "But if you ever wanted to show me, I would be honored. Not because I need proof of your strength. I already see it. But because I don't want you to feel you have to hide from me." For a long moment, Elira stood frozen, torn between years of careful protection and a single, quiet invitation that asked for nothing except trust. Slowly, with hands that trembled more than she wanted them to, she reached up and unfastened the veil. The evening light was soft, forgiving, as the fabric fell away from her face. She kept her eyes down at first, bracing herself for a reaction she had rehearsed 100 times. Pity dressed up as kindness, or worse, the careful blankness of someone hiding disgust behind good manners. Instead, there was silence. A long, still silence that stretched between them like held breath. When she finally looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she did not expect. Not pity, not shock. Something closer to quiet reverence, the way someone might look at a hard-won sunrise after a long night. He stepped closer, slowly enough that she could stop him if she wanted to, and reached up to gently cup the side of her face, where the scar traveled from her cheekbone toward her jaw. He said nothing. He simply leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to that first scar. Elira's breath shook. He moved with the same careful patience to the scar along her neck, brushing his lips there too, wordless, unhurried, as though each mark deserved its own moment of acknowledgement rather than a rushed dismissal. Then to the edge of her shoulder, where the fabric of her dress had slipped slightly, he pressed one final kiss, gentle and unafraid. He did not tell her she was beautiful despite her scars. He did not tell her the scars did not matter. Instead, his silence said something far more powerful, that they were simply part of her story, and her story was one he wanted to know, all of it, not just the parts that were easy to look at. Tears finally spilled down her cheeks, but they were different from the tears she had cried in the years since the fire. These were not tears of grief or shame. They were tears of relief, the kind that came from finally being seen completely and not turned away from. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. "Because some things don't need to be said," he answered, "only understood." They stood together by the river as darkness settled fully over the hills, and for the first time in 3 years, Elira did not feel the urge to reach for the veil lying forgotten in her hands. In the days that followed, Draven's departure came and went, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of leaving alone, he asked Elira to come north with him, not as an obligation, but as a choice entirely her own. She thought about Bettina, about the shop that had given her purpose, about the quiet life she had built in the shadows of her own fear. But she also thought about the way he had looked at her by the river, the way his silence had said more than words ever could. She chose to go. The following months were not easy, adjusting to a new place, a new set of expectations. A kingdom that watched its future queen with curious eyes was its own kind of challenge. But Draven never once asked her to cover her scars for the sake of appearances. When she stood beside him during official gatherings, she stood with her face uncovered, her scars visible to anyone who cared to look. At first, there were murmurs, whispers about the queen with the marked face, quiet questions about why she did not wear something to hide what had happened to her. But over time, the whispers faded, replaced instead by quiet respect. She spoke to refugees personally, understanding their fear and displacement in a way few in her position ever could. She sat with wounded soldiers, unafraid to let them see that scars did not make a person weak, only marked by what they had survived. The kingdom that once might have expected a flawless, untouched queen instead found something far more powerful, a woman who wore her history plainly, who had learned that hiding was never the same as healing. Elira never wore the veil again, not because she forgot what lay beneath it, but because she finally understood, through one quiet evening by the river and a series of wordless kisses, that she had never needed to hide it in the first place. The king had shown her, without a single spoken promise, that some truths did not need convincing, they only needed to be seen. And for the first time since the fire had taken everything she thought she knew about herself, Elira finally felt whole.